you are a follower of the program. If you're not, you should be, no doubt. If you are, please consult our website for future lectures coming up in the spring. The lecture series will resume. If you've been to any of the previous lectures, you know the format. We'll have about 55 minutes from our speaker tonight, and then the rest of the time until 7:30 open for questions, answers, and discussion. At some point at or before 7:30, we will break and reconvene, those of us who would like to, at a nearby restaurant, probably the Dog and Duck. But if you are interested in coming to that and you would like a ride or can offer a ride, please come down front at the end of the questions and answers, and we will arrange. Okay? So I'm extremely happy to be able to welcome this particular speaker, Rizwan Zamir, to speak with us tonight. For one thing, he's a scholar who attempts to do what we in Great Books programs do best, which is to work across disciplines, straddling two or more worlds. In his case, the worlds involved are ones that could benefit from more contact, I think. The world of Western universities and the world of traditional Islamic learning. In the United States, Rizwan has studied with a number of major Muslim scholars, the most recent one being Abdulaziz Sachedina at the University of Virginia. He's also studied seriously in such places as Qom, Iran, which many would say is the center of Muslim learning in the world today, I think. Also in Lahore and Islamabad in his native Pakistan. His intellectual interests range widely, including not only questions of Islamic theology, but a good bit of work on dialogue with thinkers in the other two Abrahamic religious traditions, Christianity and Judaism. He's engaged in the work of what I find a very hopeful international venture called the Society for Scriptural Reasoning, which brings Muslim, Jewish, and Christian thinkers together to read each other's scriptures side by side as a starting point for interreligious dialogue. Rizwan also has a long-standing interest in questions about religion and the natural sciences, which is the context in which I first met him about 3 years ago, and the realm from which his talk tonight will start. I should finally mention that in his spare time, Rizwan is currently editing 2 books. One concerns interreligious dialogue within Islam. It's a collection of essays by Muslim scholars who attempt to mine the resources of Islamic mysticism, Sufi tradition, as a way of overcoming impasses in communication between Sunni and Shi'i branches of Islam. The other contains the proceedings of a conference held last summer at Cambridge University on the early 20th century poet and philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, also a man who hailed from what would later become Pakistan, who adopted an intellectual home in the West, and who argued persuasively for the continuing validity of the Muslim intellectual tradition as one independent of that which has developed in the West, though not necessarily antagonistic to it. In other words, a worthy partner in an ongoing dialogue under a single human horizon. It is in that spirit that I hope you will join me in welcoming Rizwan Zamir to speak with us tonight on the topic of Muslim responses to Western science and technology.
Thank you. All right. Can I please ask if people can move forward and take the empty spaces so I don't have to scream too much? I want to ask you. Right? Thank you very much. Thank you, John, and thank you for to the organizers of the event. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first time in Texas, and I did not know until 2 days ago that how big Austin is as a school. Coming from Virginia, it's kind of scary, actually. But nevertheless, let me begin by first saying why I'm talking about this topic, what my personal interest is in this subject. I've been intellectually involved in debates on tradition and modernity, and that characterizes a lot of work that I do and the debates that go on in the Islamic world. Very hot topic. But I found generally that the topic is addressed in very broad terms, and I found it useful to look at one particular strand of thought or an issue within the Islamic world that has come to create a lot of antagonism, debate, conversations. And what I find unique about this topic of Muslim responses to Western modern science and technology is that there's, in comparison with other debates like feminism, women's rights, human rights, and democracy, political philosophy, and other things, there hasn't been more consensus than in this particular subject. So, for example, if you have fundamentalists, or I'm using these terms a little loosely here, but just I think they're useful, but they break down at certain points. But what we will call reformist and the fundamentalist or modernist and fundamentalist positions, they seem to agree and have agreed for a long time on this particular question of how to deal with modern science and technology. It should be surprising to some that some of the most industrialized and modernized cities in the Islamic world are what in countries where the fundamentalist interpretation sort of prevails. I have in mind areas like Gulf, Saudi Arabia, and other places like that. So even though in other areas of debate of modernity and tradition, they seem to disagree on a lot of issues. So that's why I think this topic is very interesting, and it's my way of addressing the broader debate. But I would not draw conclusions about that debate in this talk. I'll just want to give a more descriptive account of what has happened and what Muslims have been and continue to say on this subject. Okay, this being said, let me give you just a brief plan of the talk. I'll make some remarks on who is researching this subject, who has researched this topic, the topic of the relationship between Islam and science, and I don't want to give here an account of, which I'm not qualified to, from the beginning of Islam, how this discussion has proceeded. I know a little bit here and there, but more interestingly in recent times, in modern times. And when I say modern times, I mean the colonial period, which begins roughly in 18th century. But there's no exact date that you can say, but colonial period when French, British, Dutch came to occupy certain Muslim land where they used to be in power, and the crisis begins there. Okay, so first, who has researched this topic, and I'll try to explore why they have researched this subject. Then I turn to the actual responses, and in my view, what is more interesting is not what they are saying, but why they are saying what they are saying, and I think there's something to learn from that. So I'll look at different responses and also give a context of why those responses were made in this particular manner. And finally, I'll give some concluding thoughts, which I'm not making any huge claims here, but I think you can see it as a footnote of the conversations that have been happening, the future direction of this debate, and also I think so I've been witness to dialogues among Christians, Muslims. There was a conference on International Congress on Religion and Science back in 2006 where I presented a paper, and in which scholars in the field of religion and science, very thriving field in the last 20, 30 years, so much has been written. So Christian scholars went to Iran, and there were Muslim scholars coming from all over the Islamic world and speaking to each other. So I hope we'll have some time to discuss that, and maybe in the question answer session. So I'll make a few comments about that. Okay. This being said, let me turn to the first part, which is who has been interested in the debate, and why, and from what point of view. Now, I just begin with the quote from one of the Western scholars, Toby Huff, who wrote a book, The Rise of Islam, The Rise of Islamic Science. I think that's the correct title. And he says there is strong evidence that Arabic science contributed the most intellectual capital to the breakthrough to modern science in the West in the 12th and 13th centuries, and thereafter. The problem of Arabic science, and I want to put it in quotes, the problem of Arabic science has at least two dimensions. One concerns the failure of Arabic science to give birth to modern science. The other concerns the apparent decline and retrogression of scientific thought and practice in Arabic Islamic civilization after the 13th century. Okay, so from this point of view, the interest, and this is not, Huff is not alone in making these claims. This is a representative of a larger conversation or claims which have been made in last good 200 years from Western scholars. And I would try to break this statement down. On the one hand, what we see here, what Chobi Huff is seeking and other historians and philosophers of science have been seeking are the contributions that Muslims have made to modern science. So that's one part, the contribution part. In looking at and the perspective that is involved here sees Islamic science as a chapter of modern Western science. So something like if this is the linear evolutionary progress of science, you have Greeks, say Egyptians, Greeks, Hindus, Chinese, and Muslims kind of taking some space, and then we get to modern science, and then the questions are posed why Islamic science didn't give rise to the modern science. So I call it like evolutionary view of science. So that's one part, how they've come to see it. And the second, which I call kind of a value judgment, and which is assumed, sometimes made implicit, sometimes comes out very explicitly, is decline of science means decline of civilization. And this perspective also prevailed for a long time, and we can talk about it afterwards if we need to. But there's a reason why I'm talking about this, because it will have influence. This perspective will have an impact on the way Muslims will come to see their own intellectual tradition and also their own history, when they will go about doing their history of science. Okay, so what here, as I said, decline of science means failure of the civilization. Since Muslims failed to give birth to modern science, they have failed as a civilization. What is missing in this discussion, in this evolutionary view of science, is an important question, the integrity of the science Muslims did, why they did that, what point of view they had, how did they see the world, what's different. So not so much the contributions that they have made to get to where they are, where we are right now, but how did they see the world and what role that science played in that intellectual scientific universe. So that question wasn't asked and will be asked later on by Muslims, and they'll contest. And I think some Western historians of science like Thomas Kuhn himself would object to that. Okay, so that's one. And the second important issue is the inherent conflict between religion and science, which was assumed by Western historians of science and sociologists and philosophers. It goes back to Enlightenment, and I'll just give some quotations here. Ernest Renan, a 19th century French philosopher and also was interested in studying Islamic civilization. His quotes are, "Islam is the scorn of science, the removal of the civil company. It is the terrible simplicity of the Semitic spirit, narrowing the human brain, closing it with any delicate idea, any fine feeling, with any rational research, to put it opposite an eternal tautology." So what he calls rational thought here can, in that cultural, historical context, be seen as scientific thinking or scientific thought. He also says, little science and philosophy that Muslims had produced was the result of the little science and philosophy that Muslims had produced was the result of a rebellion against Islam. So this antagonism between Islam as a religion which resists any scientific rational thought and and rationality, reason, Enlightenment thinking, and so on and so forth. Another quote, the Oriental mind is incapable of rational thought and philosophy and was responsible for blocking the development of science and learning in the Muslim world. Okay, so this gave rise to certain strands of scholarship in which dissident voices, certain people who were Muhammad Zakaria Razi, a very famous 10th, 11th century figure, was considered an amazing physician, and his books were taught in the medieval West as well, became one of those figures. So you look in history to find people who were criticized by what people are calling orthodox ulama class, and they were used as examples for how religion is inherently opposed to any scientific inquiry. Okay, so this being said, this is the Western side of things, but let me turn to now Muslims and what they have been saying or what they have said. Now, before I begin talk about the actual responses, let me say a few words about the origins of the debate. The origins of the debate, when it began, how, why, what was the social historical context, and I think in my view, as I have said before, it's not so much the responses that came out, but why the responses came out in a particular way that's more interesting. Okay, so origins of the debate are in, again, as I said, in the colonial period, 18th century, when most of the Muslim world came to be colonized. And this colonization from the point of view of Muslims was a surprise. And surprise, they saw it as if something has gone wrong in their history. What happened? We were at the top of the world. We had these three empires, the Safavids and the Ottomans and the Mughals, and all of a sudden they're all collapsing and losing, and eventually, for example, British, only 60,000 British historians tell us at the peak of their power were in India. So when they asked themselves what made that colonization possible, and the answer was technology, military technology to be more specific, naval power, artillery, cannons, this and that. So looking at the situation, then we see Muslims really seeking for the first time, I won't say for the first time, but in this particular context, the notion of power becomes extremely crucial. How do we get out of our colonial subjugation? That's the question which they have in mind. That's the question that haunts many, and there's some other developments which I'll get to later on. But for now, this is important, that colonial experience meant power, seeking power to resist it and to overcome it. Okay, so what we see then, under the impact of colonialism or challenge from the Western imperial powers, first one to respond are the Ottomans by introducing, the period is called the Tanzimat period, in which they introduced Western sciences to the curriculum of schools. Foreign teachers of science were invited to teach the up-to-date theories and practices of science. And almost modern scientific thought had become indispensable for them. But again, the aim was technological breakthrough, and in the military domain primarily. It wasn't that science is really rational and wonderful and amazing that we have to get it, and it's more, how do we fix our situation here? Okay, so, this is also the period when we see a rise of a new elite. New elite, many figures. I would refrain from giving you the names but we can talk about it afterwards if you want particular references. But they will be, they'll all be concerned about the issues of learning, education, relationship of science and Islam, and so on and so forth. Many of them, like Afghani and Abdu, I just did it, I gave you a name. But they posited that there is really no dichotomy between Islam and science. They are very compatible. Sayyid Ahmad Khan in India, he used modern science as the epistemic foundation for his Quranic hermeneutics, Quran, the scripture of Islam. So if we have to understand it, we have to understand it in line with, or in consistency with the findings of the modern science, Newtonian science, to be really sure at this point. Again, in Egypt and other places, many other figures, but they all seem to agree that science, technology, progress, rationality, they're all very compatible, and they actively and aggressively argued for it, because for them, this is the most indispensable and much needed thing at this moment. Okay, so now what is characteristically different in this particular period is this epistemology of trying to find a reconciliation between science and Islam. This is really unique in the sense that before, if you look at pre-18th century normative theories of knowledge in any of the texts, people like Nasiruddin Tusi, Zarnuji, Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Qutbuddin Shirazi, many people who have discussed knowledge. What is knowledge? Why knowledge? These kinds of the big questions. None of them saw it in the way these reformist new elite people saw it. Why? Because for them, knowledge was hikmah. That's the term which is used. It's a Quranic term, which means wisdom. It also meant, and then they related to the science of the soul, meaning knowledge as means for happiness, for perfection of the soul, and so on and so forth. So normative accounts did not include any relationship with power, with worldly power. So it's not a theory which assumes that knowledge is a mean to get to worldly power. That was out. So that we are talking about pre-18th century. But here, starting 18th century, we actually find Muslims arguing aggressively. These people, and they have a very special role because this will be the new intellectual elite, and this will drive the civilization or Muslim cultures forward. When the state formation happens, then these people would have a lot of impact, and their disciples would be, for example, Pakistan, the country I come from, was set up and was run, the early generation was the Aligarh movement. I just named one person, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who tried to reconcile Quran with the Newtonian physics. So this is the Aligarh movement. The people from the Aligarh movement will be in power and will be the early presidents and prime ministers, and they will form the policies. Okay, so I think that's very crucial. This point is extremely crucial, that the normative account of knowledge, why seek knowledge, why knowledge is needed, has changed in this moment. And this will be contested later on, but this is a fundamental paradigm change from the point of view of Islamic intellectual tradition. Okay, so here's a quote from one of the, this book came out in 1992, and it resonates the same idea that I'm presenting, the new normative theory of knowledge. He says, there is no clearer statement on the subject than this. No longer is science, as in the splendid courts of Harun and Mamun, simply entertainment for enlightened princes or a subject for the exchange of polemics between scholars. Instead, it has become the very means by which, for better or for worse, the entire human civilization is being irreversibly transformed. Military strength, political power, and economic prosperity have become contingent upon the ability of modern nations to understand, control, and create modern science. So I haven't found such a fleshed out statement from a reformist camp saying very clearly it's all about power, and if you want power, social influence, economic prosperity, you need science, or else you're going to. So it's a very pragmatic concern, goes back to the colonial period, and it enters the normative theory of knowledge, and that, I think, is unique. Okay, so, and thus begins what one of the historians of Islamic science calls the catching up syndrome. So from the colonial period, Muslims are catching up the West in science, technology, in military, and it's search for power, it's search for independence and that colonial, which from their point of view, post-independence, when the nations were independent of the imperial powers, they still think we haven't really quite gotten there. So this just continues, this trend continues and continues. Okay. Now, what is also important to note here is that the philosophical underpinnings of modern science were really far from Muslim intellectual repertoire at that point. Most people who were these so-called reformers had no training whatsoever, neither in modern Western science or scientific history of science or philosophy of science. At the same time, this new elite class was not trained in traditional seminaries. Many of the major figures, except for Abdu, who would be an exception, most of them were independent scholars, not trained through a seminary to be really acquainted with the traditional philosophy, like Islamic philosophy or Islamic theology or Islamic sciences of nature and so on and so forth. So their response, so on the one hand, not familiar with the Western intellectual history, on the other, not being familiar with the Islamic intellectual history. But yet the concern was very real and very pragmatic. We have to do something about this. So I call it the pragmatic concern and pragmatic view of knowledge, which is driving the whole enterprise. Okay, so, and at the same time, and here's another problem that was also unique in that period, that when encountered with Western science and technology in this manner, and languages were introduced, like Western style universities were introduced, there was this emergency situation in which they had to respond. It was not that you can sit back and take your time and figure out what are the implications of holding on to this point of view if you study Western science, and if you incorporate Western technology into your framework, how would it really play out? So because this is a colonial context, so you can say shortcut solutions were made. But here's something interesting that Shagan draws out, and I think it's really crucial to see the mindset of Muslims of 18th, 19th century and what they were going through. Let us imagine a hypothetical individual clamped in the jaws of this split, in the interior of his or her soul, and wrestling with the contradictory double fascination. The enchanted vision of a world still infused with the aura of collective memory, which is tradition, and the equally compelling allure of the new and the unknown, which you can call modernity or modern science. Such a person would feel strongly alienated both by the shock of the radical changes affecting him and by a pervasive nostalgia made doubly poignant by the progressive withdrawal from the world stage of the universe to which it refers, leaving everywhere the signs of its imminent disappearance. This hypothetical individual would reason more or less as follows. So this hypothetical individual is a Muslim of an 18th, 19th century. The new ideas assailing me, the new objects I see ranged before me in all their depth and solidity, are wholly alien to me. I have neither appropriate words nor adequate mental imagery to understand them properly. They are something inaccessible surging suddenly into my field of knowledge. It is true that I perceive them, that I make use of them, that I exercise command over them, as well as having to endure them, but somehow they remain apart, suspended in abeyance amid the flux of my memory. I cannot trace their genesis, nor was I present at their birth. I played no part in the succession of crises which preceded their fabrication, or in the modes of production which made them possible. They are strange, outlandish things that I cannot avoid, things that upset my habits and constrain me in inescapable ways. But there is something in them which I find seductive, which attracts me, something whose support I can hardly do without, even by making every effort. In the West, revolutions caused by scientific and technical upheavals produced paradigm shifts which molded consciousness to the imperatives of each new way of looking. This has not occurred in my case. As a result of continual bombardment, I am susceptible to the irresistible attraction of new things, but their genealogy and archaeology remains unknown to me. New ideas strike me with full force, stamp their imprints on my mind. leaving indelible traces, but hardly manage to alter the content of a memory which refers stubbornly to its own genealogy. So that's the kind of mindset we are talking about here, and the rift, and I think it's very characteristic of that period of Islamic history, and is witnessed in all regions. Not, I mean, I won't say all regions, but in the central lands, and also be it the aftermath of both the Ottoman Empire, Safavids, and in the Mughal India. That's what I focus on in this paper. Okay, so it is only in the light of this tension and its social and psychological consequences that the early reactions of the Muslim intellectuals to the challenges of modern science and technology could be understood. The ignorance of the Islamic intellectual elite about the Western civilization since then has persisted. These people rejected tradition, not finding it helpful, for one thing, never encountered it in the first place. Why? And then you see later on many Muslims who are scientists, wonderful doctors, engineers, and so on and so forth, but have no background in either the Islamic intellectual thought or in the Western, say, intellectual history or philosophy of science or history of science. So, what came out of that are two things, and that goes back to the first section of the talk with the Western interest and their responses. First, this narrative of the evolutionary science was accepted. Yes, we did something and then we just gave it up. It all went to the West, and our work is just another chapter. It's again, this view of Islamic science as a chapter of modern science was accepted. That's one. The other and more interesting aspect, that antagonism between religion and science was also accepted. Many works were written which very staunchly and aggressively criticizing the so-called orthodoxy, the ulama class, the scholarly class, people who are the carriers of the tradition, so to speak, saying that you've all gone wrong and you are the reason for the decline of our civilization. So that thesis, decline of science equals decline of civilization, and it is because of orthodoxy that it has happened. This view was accepted. Here's a Afghani's response. He's writing to Renan, and actually it's funny that this response didn't go out to Muslims. It was in the private correspondence and later discovered. And he says, if it is true that the Muslim religion is an obstacle to the development of sciences, can one affirm that this obstacle will not disappear someday? How does the Muslim religion differ on this point from any other religion? All religions are intolerant, each one in its way. So this narrative is also accepted that there is an inherent conflict between Islam and scientific research, rationality, reason, progress, all of that. Ulama were criticized for their backwardness. The gates of ijtihad, it's a term which is a very legal term actually, but broadly construed as reasoning. Ijtihad is independent reasoning to look for new rulings in Islamic Sharia. So it said gates of ijtihad were closed since the death of rationalism of the Mu'tazilite thought, which was back in the 10th century. So after 10th, 11th century, Muslims stopped thinking because the gates of ijtihad were closed. Qasim Amin called Islam itself a source of hindrance to the progress of Islamic civilization, since true progress is due to science and science alone. And that is why Europe has advanced in every sphere of life, from philosophical, social, to moral thought and practice. So not only science is a means to progress, but it's also a means of moral progress, spiritual progress, and all the other kinds of progresses. Okay, so the question of the rise and fall of Islamic civilization was tied directly to the rise of scientific enterprise in the Islamic world. This narrative, as I'm trying to show, was not indigenous, but was a borrowed one. One of the key essays written by Goldziher, I think it was a Jewish Orientalist, wrote an essay in 1960, The Attitude of Orthodox Islam to Science. I think that's the title of it. That became the standard for the narrative, saying everything except religious orthodoxy was always opposed to foreign sciences, and by foreign, Goldziher meant Hellenic traditions, all the Hellenic heritage that Muslims borrowed or integrated in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries. So that was, that orthodoxy was always opposed to that. And that narrative was accepted by all Muslims who are now more in tune with the Western scholarship on Islam than being trained in a seminary to see things from within, so to speak. Okay, so I'll just give you in the end the title of a book that I early quoted is called, it came out I think in 1992 by Pervez Hoodboy. He's a nuclear physicist, and his book is titled Islam and Science, Religious Orthodoxy and the Battle for Rationality. So this is 1992, and we are talking about 19th century. From 19th century all the way up till now, this is with us, and this debate is with us, and this tension between, assumed tension between religious orthodoxy, ulama, and science is with us until today. Okay, now to the actual responses. I think this is a good background to now see what they actually were saying. First is what I broadly call accommodation and approval response. We've talked about it, all these figures that I've named, and why these figures are more important, because they were more, as I said, more influential in determining the policies that will be made and the broadly how Muslim societies will move forward, practically engaging. Even today, most money is thrown out for science than for humanities, social sciences, and other stuff in all parts of the Islamic world. It's not true for one or the other place, but it's common to all of them. Now, so the kinds of responses they gave, as I said, they're trying to reconcile Islam and science because there's a tension, so they have to respond to that. And they will say, if you study science, you pray, you love God, obey the laws of Sharia, everything is fine, there is no problem. That's one way of saying it. Second, science was our property until this time. It went to the West. We need to reclaim our heritage. Science is our heritage. We need to reclaim it. And which means do more science so you can reclaim your heritage. And the third, which, as I said, the normative account of knowledge is for the first time, changes completely. They equated ilm, which is a traditional Arabic word for not only science, wisdom, and ilm, religious sciences, secular sciences, we call them secular sciences, but all sciences are called alum, which means science, simple science. Now, ilm term means nothing else but science. So none of this other. Philosophy is not ilm. Even religious sciences, in as much we need them, yes, we do study them, but it was reduced to, like, almost equated. The knowledge is equated with knowledge of what? Knowledge of modern science and technology. What results from it? Okay, so major figures of Ghani, Muhammad Abdu, his disciple, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, as I said, Aligarh movement, many other people in Aligarh movement, Chirag Ali and others. Even to some extent Iqbal, but Iqbal is somewhat different, I think. I shouldn't lump him here, but I have, unfortunately. Okay. So from this point of view, it was not science that had to be Quranic in character, but Quran has to be scientific. Quran has to come across as a very scientific document. And what would happen more than any in this genre of literature on relationship between Islam and science, you won't find more literature written on active attempts to reconcile particular verses of Quran with particular findings of modern science. There's a book called Quran, the Bible, and Science, I think. It's been translated into every Islamic language probably 10 times. And is read, and Muslims are like, yeah, see, the Quran is so scientific, we have it all. And so it's always this attempt back again and again to show that Quran, every new finding, here we go, here's another verse which is exactly saying what the science is saying. So that's one. Then the other one, which probably some of us are familiar with, what we call the mostly literalist or fundamentalist approach, complete rejection of sometimes seeing it as an alien for science because it's coming from the West. It's seen with suspicion. Maybe there's a hidden agenda and all of that. Or it just seems ungodly, this kind of stuff. Now, I remember a very funny story back in the 60s. My father told me about this, that when Neil Armstrong went to the moon and this preacher in Sialkot, a city in Pakistan, he was preaching very loudly, like, yeah, it was the the full moon. That's why he was able to step on it. If it was the moon of the first, he would have fallen. So things like that. So I mean, but at the same time, it's important to realize that this position remains on the margin. It remains marginalized. So here and there, they can get some people to not study modern science. They resist modern sciences being taught to kids in institutions, but largely from the state schooling and other state schooling, and what really determines how the society moves forward has nothing to do with them. So it's a marginalized position. Okay. And then the third position, which I call the absent third, is a position which only recently some people are trying to formulate. And in formulation, and why it hasn't been noticed so far, I think it's a problem with the scholarship, people like me and others who have focused on the more extreme positions. Both positions seem very, what's the right word here? Sensational. So we look for the sensational generally. So fundamentalist people in the streets are screaming, don't publish Darwin's, original species. That makes it to scholarship. And then on the other hand, if you say people who go out on the streets and really trying to resist so-called orthodoxy and the dissident voices, they make it to the scholarship. But the third, and Ashraf Ali Thanvi, one of the 20th century scholars, recently an essay came out in which the scholar shows that how he tried to respond not so much from this pragmatic point of view of how we can interpret it, but from a philosophical point of view, an engagement with modern science and its philosophical metaphysical presuppositions. So that literature is still missing of what the traditional ulama or seminary class has or had said about these issues. They were generally seen as, they were just opposed to this whole science thing, and they were always lumped to the fundamentalist camp, which now scholarship, I think, is trying to be more careful and show, no, there were intelligent engagement and responses from them, not simply kind of a fundamentalist rejectionist account. Okay, so these are the three responses. We can also, another scholar, I liked his way of categorizing them. One is more calls it the ethical, puritanical response, where you have science, technology, TV, this and that, you just try to be ethical and it's all fine, no problems. The other one is more epistemic, which looks at the epistemological consequences of scientific theory and tries to account for it, or sometimes use postmodern critique of scientific thought and scientific worldview and bases its critique on that, uses that. And the third, which is more metaphysical, what he calls metaphysical, which started, I think, for the first time in 1950s, unless the traditional response and people like Thanvi are explored and we hear more about them. So this third response sees the metaphysical framework within which science operates, implicit assumptions made fully fleshed out, and then compares it with the traditional Islamic philosophy, Sufi metaphysics, and so on and so forth, and sees where we meet, where we don't meet, and what needs to be, where do we need to work hard and find a way to reconcile the findings of the modern, like quantum physics. So quantum physics, what do we do with that, and how does it impact not so much the pragmatic concern, how do we get power, but what are the real serious theological implications of quantum physics for us that we need to address? So that response has only recently started. And with 20, 30 years, people like Nasser and his disciples, many Osman Bakr, he's a Malaysian scholar, Ibrahim Khalin, many other names, but largely influenced by Syed Hussein Nasr, who's in George Washington University. Okay, now, having said all of this, this was the narrative of what has happened in the 200 years. Now, as I said, I don't have grand conclusions to what to make of all this, what to make of what to give you here. It's like, here's something that you can take maybe, and that's I'm interested in maybe in the question answer session you want to make some comments when you hear this story, what comes out for you, what do you hear, and it might be helpful for me in my own thinking. Now, personally, this divide between the pragmatic, this pragmatic concern, which is with us for like 200 years, is extremely dangerous. Now we're witnessing the ecological crisis. We are more aware of it, and if this persists, which it has persisted, I remember one of the scholars. He came to Pakistan and he questioned this drive for technology. So you see that now the equation is very simple. We want to be more powerful and influential in the world. For that, we need power, which could be economic or political, which would mean more industrialization. Industrialization would mean more ecological crisis, and so on and so forth. So this particular scholar questioned this, what we have done in last so many 50, 60 years, and the president of Pakistan got extremely upset with him, and he refused to talk to him. He said, "You're undermining everything we do. There's certain institutes for the promotion of science and technology. They send people abroad to get more science, so you come back and you give us more science, and we develop our science and we get more powerful." So they even refused to talk to those people. So I think personally I would like to see a more normative account of really what do we understand, how do we understand the epistemological and metaphysical claims of science, or the assumed assumptions, and how do we then respond to them from a more philosophical point of view. Philosophy of nature has been completely Muslims' philosophy of nature, meaning how do we see nature, has a huge consequence. How do we treat it? So it used to be, for example, in the traditional accounts, it's a sign of God, it's a theophany of God, it's a partner of God. It's a theophany of God, it's a partner with man, and needs to be seen that way. It links you, you're part of the universe, you're part of this nature group. Now it's there to be abused. As I said, from the reformist camp, they looked for verses of Quran which would sanction the abuse of nature so that industrialization and so on could be made possible. And so that worries me and many other people. And there has been a lot of discussion. I don't want to say it's just this happening, because there has been a lot of discussion about the theological issues involved, metaphysical issues involved. And in that, some conversations like that in Iran, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, where Muslims met Christians and they're trying to learn from them to see what they have said and because their engagement with issues of modern science and the challenges it poses to theology is much longer and historically than ours. So ours is a new phenomenon, and so that conversation is happening. At the same time, the governments do what they do, and they largely see it. They haven't come to see things any different. So this drive for more power continues, and I think continues to hurt us, actually. All right, that's all I have to say. Thank you.